So, and again, we want to try to keep this as an open conversation. So after each of the slides, we'll take a pause and answer any questions that are particular to that slide at that time. But just a little bit more about me. I like to talk about me. But I was gene tested in 2005, and I have a 42 repeat, and came to a number of conventions, I think from 2007 to 2012, and kind of stepped back for a little bit, and this is the first convention I've attended since then. But I've been involved in about a dozen or more different research projects that have been out there, a number of observational studies, as well as a number of clinical trials. And if you want to know the difference, stay tuned, we'll tell you about that. Why should I participate in research? This is always something that's been really close to me. I think it's really important, as I've told a lot of people, is to have as many data points out there as possible. I actually got involved before I got tested in 2003, so I've been involved in studies since 2003. I was involved in PHAROS, which was the precursor to Predict HD, which was the precursor to Enroll, which are observational studies where they collected information, and I got involved in that even prior to getting tested, because I figured if I was going to be positive, I wanted to make sure that there was as many data points out there on me as possible. And it's always kind of interesting to look back at some of these studies, because you can almost identify where you are on some of these charts that you read in these reports. Also, I just wanted to advance the science. I wanted to help the HD community, possibly help myself, as well as help my kids. I have 2 adult kids at this point. When I got involved with this, who were teenagers, but now they're adults, and one is at risk, and my daughter tested negative. So, a little bit about the difference between clinical trials and observational trials.
Perfect. So first, I thought it might be helpful just to briefly touch on my role as a research coordinator as well, just so you kind of know my affiliation here. So I work directly with the Center of Excellence that's conducting the research trial, and I kind of joke like I do the legwork of the study itself. So I'm the person who generally, communicates really directly with the patients about the opportunity, schedules the visits, talks about what the study is, and then at those visits, you spend majority of your time with me. Of course, Dr. Kumar comes in and makes his celebrity appearance and does his important doctor stuff, but as far as kind of like the nitty-gritty part of the research study, that's when you're hanging out with me a lot. So just to touch a little bit on, like Greg said, the difference between like an observational and an interventional study. Clinical trial is just a general term for any research study that involves a human participant, someone who volunteers their time to participate in the study. And there's kind of 2 big buckets that I like to think of studies falling into. One is an observational study, which is exactly kind of what it sounds like, where the participant is observed over a period of time to learn more potentially about like the natural history of the disease, sometimes looking at cause and effect relationships. And like Greg touched on, probably the best known current study that's observational is the Enroll HD study. Patients come in once a year, they answer a variety of questions. They have a motor assessment where many of you in the room have probably participated in, where you've got to tap your fingers, walk up and down the hallway. It's very specific for Huntington's disease, some brief memory thinking, and it allows us to get snapshots over time to learn more about the disease, try to improve our clinical care, and again, that's what a lot of observational studies are. The second kind of big bucket that a lot of studies fall into is probably what most of us think of when you hear clinical trial, and that's when that's an interventional trial. So someone has developed an intervention to try to help with either the symptoms or underlying disease of Huntington's. If you hear, that can be either like a medication itself or maybe like a therapy. I know there's a music study that's going on right now looking at the effects of music in Huntington's. But again, there's an intervention, there's something new that's being tested to try to understand how that's impacting Huntington's.
I'd like to open up if there are any questions or conversations we want to have about this. Okay.
Easy.
Make it easy. Oh, yes.
Are there any studies for people that are at risk but haven't been tested yet?
Yeah, that's what I was mentioning. I got involved in a study, observational study. That time was the Pharaoh study, but the Enroll study is open to people that are at risk. And that's what I wanted to do, is just get some more, you'll hear me say a number of times, data points out there for things in case, want to help out as much as possible.
Yep, and just to add, the nice thing about the Enroll study is if you're at risk, not tested, and still kind of deciding about getting tested for yourself, the Enroll study, you don't find out your gene status. So you're able to, maintain that anonymity and not have that information, but you can, still contribute, like Greg said, which I know is very important to do. So, good question.
Next slide.
Okay, and then now just to kind of dive a little bit more, again, kind of thinking a little bit more specifically about those interventional trials. So again, kind of two main buckets that those interventional trials can fall into. The first is going to be an intervention for symptom management. So you think, HD has a lot of different symptoms that people deal with. There's the movements, there's chorea, there's changes in memory thinking, there can be changes in personality, and like we just, for some of you who are in the room, we talked about like anxiety, depression, there can be other components of Huntington's. So sometimes there can be studies that, again, are focused on symptom management, trying to find an intervention to try to help with a specific symptom. And then the second kind of broad category is a disease-modifying trial. So that is a study of an intervention trying to test, thank you, Greg, trying to test something to impact like the underlying disease itself, slow the disease progression, or potentially delay the onset of symptoms. Greg and I are from Colorado, so I kind of like to think of disease modification studies as instead of your disease course being like a blue, right, where you go in here, we're trying to make you a green, okay? So we're trying to keep you better for longer, trying to slow down the onset of symptoms. A couple other key words you can think of is if you hear something as like a gene therapy or neuroprotective, that would be kind of a trigger word for you to know, okay, this is disease modifying, try to, again, impact the overall disease process.
And when we refer to blue and green, are you talking ski slopes?
Yes. Oh, yes. Sorry. I should have probably started with that. Blue and green ski slopes. Yes. Sorry. That was, hopefully you caught it on my sign language, but yes.
We're sitting at sea level here.
Yes.
So.
That's fair. Below sea level.
Below
Oh,
sea
yeah.
level, yes.
That's very fair.
I know when I run here, I get my best times ever when I run the French Quarter.
Yeah. Any questions about that one? Sorry.
Oh, please. Okay.
Okay.
Next one.
Onward. Sorry, I'm talking a lot here. The next one we just wanted to touch on a little bit is the different phases of research studies. So as you can see, I really like this picture down at the bottom. That's that kind of timeline, right? So you think of medications when they're initially, found, created, the kind of process of getting it from what we say, getting it from bench to bedside, right? From, hey, we've created this study medication, we need to learn more about it. How do we get it to the point where we can give it to people in a clinic and have people just write a prescription and be able to give it to patients who need it? So as you can kind of see, the first little bright blue box is the preclinical phase. And so that's before it is ever, potentially distributed in humans. We first do preclinical work. So it's done in like cell lines or animal models. One of the benefits is because HD is genetic, there's really strong animal models of HD. So there's mice, there's rats, there's mini pigs. So we're able to do a lot of work to try to see, do we think that this study drug will be safe and well tolerated? And do we think that it will work? Do we think it will do what we hope it will, right? So we do our best to try to learn as much as we can before we take that next step into human volunteers. And then, as you can see, we move into our green box, which is the phase 1 clinical trials. Usually small number of patients, really focused on the safety and tolerability, usually starting at low doses. And again, just trying to make sure before we jump up to the next phase that we're as confident as we can be that it will be as safe as possible. Of course, all all medications that are approved have, potential side effects. Same thing goes with study medications. So important to try to get an understanding of what those are. And then as you can see, as you kind of move through the phases, you start to add more and more patients to the studies. They start to get longer in time. So they go from a couple months to maybe a year to a couple years. So they get longer and longer. And then you're also starting to kind of shift your focus from just safety and tolerability to also adding in efficacy. Is it doing what we think it will? And then assuming that it kind of passes successfully through each of those phases, then it hopefully goes to the FDA for approval, which is I know what we are all hoping for with all these exciting studies that are going on currently.
Yeah, and my personal experience with this is I've been involved in all three phases of these drug trials. Some of the really short, just a small number of us involved in some of these safety ones. In phase 1 and phase 2, I was involved in the Signal trial, which started as a phase 2, and then it was modified to phase 2/3 as they were getting some indication of some positive reactions from the drug. So it went from being just about 75 of us in the study to going up to about 200 people in the study. And it went from 18 months to a 3-year study at that time. So that's kind of what you're signing up for when you get into some of these studies, is there is some changing around as they get some initial information and such. So things can change.
Any questions about this one?
Can you talk about having a care partner and the role that your care partner has played, if you have one in any of your phases?
Yeah, my wife is always involved in my decisions on which studies we get involved in, and she's very involved in reading through all the, there's always a lot of information. My go-to information is HD Buzz, Leora. I'll give you a shout out because I just follow what the possibilities are for upcoming studies, kind of the difference between this study and that study, and then do a little bit of research on each of the different clinics' websites. And my wife and I usually have a dinner conversation of is this the right one to go to or not? But at the point where I'm at now, where I'm kind of sitting on the pre-symptomatic side of HD, a lot of the stuff that I've been going to, I just usually go into by myself and sit there with
With me.
and let them entertain me for a couple hours or more.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there are some studies that require you to have a care partner and some studies that don't, or there's maybe some visits they have to come to, some visits they don't have to. So a really important question to ask, I think, specifically for any study is just understanding what that requirement is, because it's a little different for each study. Mm-hmm. Any others on this slide before we keep rolling? Okay. Perfect. So now just kind of going to touch on some of the criteria for potentially entering a study and kind of what the different studies look for. The one thing I want to highlight before diving into each of the criteria themselves is that it's not intended to keep people out of the study. It's intended to make sure that the people that are included in the study, trying to keep you as safe as possible, so trying to make sure that that is top priority, and then also trying to make sure that, each study medication, right, they've done a lot of preclinical work, so maybe have an idea of the types of patients that they think would benefit the most from the study medication, right? So the goal is trying to pick the ideal patients that will hopefully tolerate the study medication the best, that it will be the safest to try it in, and that it will work in, right? So again, it's not trying to be mean and keep people out. I know sometimes I wish there was, wiggle room, but right, we've got to set some lines in the sand sometimes. But again, it's intended to make sure the people that are in the trial, trying to keep them as safe as possible and trying to make sure that they'll have the most benefit if possible. So some of the different things that they might look at is like the stage of the disease. So either depending on what the study is, like how well maybe you're functioning day to day, or the types of symptoms that you might be having. Then there can be either sometimes age can be a factor. Your CAG repeat length can be a factor. There's also some scores that have been implemented a little bit more recently that you might hear about. One of them is called a CAP score, and it's a calculation that takes into account your age and your CAG repeat length. So that kind of gives people, based on that score, it can give you an idea of maybe where you're at in your HD journey. Another one that's similar to a CAP score, but just slightly more complicated, to be honest. It's kind of a pain to calculate, thank goodness for Excel. But what it does is it also takes into account your motor score. So on that exam that we talked about, where you're tapping and walking up and down the hallway, it takes into account that score as well as your score on a cognitive test. It's called the symbol digit modality test. For those of you, again, who do enroll, you have a bunch of numbers that match with symbols, and you've got to write those in. So it takes into account those other scores, again, to get an idea about some different things. And then these last three things are, again, kind of targeted at that safety. So looking at past medications, past medical history. If they know that this potential study drug might have a certain set of side effects, then they want to make sure they're not putting people in who are already, maybe at a higher risk, right? Again, trying to keep safety as the top priority. And then the last one I know has been especially sticky in recent years is also previous studies. The, again, intention is to try to keep patients safe, and because you maybe had that previous exposure, it might have, changed something. And so again, trying to make sure that we're not putting you at a heightened risk based on previous studies. Sometimes it can be just a certain amount of time between studies and then you can move along. And sometimes it just depends on what type of study it was. But again, something that's important to try to understand before joining a study is just that reality that sometimes being part of a study might prevent you from future trials. Not meant to scare anyone, but just it's just important to be aware of, right? So.
Yeah, and one thing that I've kind of learned going through this and being involved in some of these studies is some of this criteria is a little movable, and sometimes it kind of changes around as they're modifying the study and getting it through approvals here or there. So some of this stuff will change, and it's always, being flexible is the best way to be when it comes to some of these criteria. And as Liza said, it's for the participants' safety as well as the integrity of the study to use these criteria and for inclusion.
Definitely. Any questions about that? Yeah.
As you enter a study, is it common for the people in charge of the study to inform you whether or not this would exclude you from other potential studies?
That's a very fair question. The thing that can be a little bit tricky about that is that if let's say I'm in study 1, and then I sign up for study 1, I do study 1, and then study 2 comes along, you don't know until study 2 comes along what their criteria to enter the study is. So that can be a little bit tricky. Like we talked about with those interventional studies, if it's something that's like a gene therapy or that more is that intervention that's trying to slow disease progression, that's probably more likely to prevent you from going into future studies, but unfortunately it's kind of one of those tricky things where you don't really know until you know. But I definitely will say from my experience, I try to be as transparent as possible about that reality. But again, it's unfortunately you don't really know till you know.
Yeah, I know, and just from personal experience, recently I've started taking some new medication, and I did talk with Liza as well as Dr. Kumar, which is kind of the neurologist over our Center of Excellence there in Colorado, or one of ours, and making sure, the medication wasn't going to exclude me from possible future studies. So just kind of having all those kinds of things in the back of your mind, having a good relationship with your research coordinators, and the key thing is that Center of Excellence, those people can really be on top of those kinds of things. So yeah, I'm going to start taking this. This is going to be a problem if this study does come up, and I'm kind of referring to like the PTC trial, for example, which is something we're all kind of holding on to here, and the possibility of that opening up here in the United States. I'm 61. I think it's more just more of being able to help the community out. I don't know if I've gotten any medical benefits, because reading through the data, the signal trial that I was involved in didn't show a result, and I read through all that data. Recently I was involved in the SHIELD trial, which kind of vanished inexplicably from HSG's website. I was supposed to go in for a closeout visit at the end of December, and I got a call 3 days before from my colleague here, and she said it disappeared. But I don't know if I've gotten any benefits, and you do find out, and we'll talk about it here in a little bit, that whether you were on the drug or were you on the placebo. think a lot of things that have helped me out, if you're referring to my age, my advanced age, or in wisdom. I think I'm a very active person and do a lot of mountain biking and skiing and hiking and such out there in Colorado, and burro racing, which you'll see here at the end. But also, the career I had was a very cognitive, demanding job. I was really involved in a lot of I was a project manager and involved in doing a lot of traveling. Which is why I kind of retired when I got my 30 years in with the National Park Service and checked out, because I wanted to spend, instead of those 2 weeks on the road a month, I wanted to be at home. And I wanted my tickets to Red Rocks.
Fair. Any other questions about this one?
Yeah, here's a list of all these things that you can kind of go through and experience as a participant. And I think this is one of the things that kind of came up when Eliza and I were walking is, it's nice to hear from a participant what it's like to get blood draws, every 6 months. And, most people have blood draws, it's not too bad. I've gone in and done a lot of MRI scans and CT scans. You're a little confined in that, but most of the time they can give you some nice, I always listen to Coldplay when I go into the tube. And then I usually am asleep before I come out. Some of it you have to stay awake for, and then they come and tap on your feet. Wake up. We need your brain awake. LPs or lumbar punctures, spinal taps. I know this is always a concern of a lot of people. I always hear about it at support groups. I facilitate a couple support groups with our social worker in Colorado, and a national one that we do. And it always comes up, how do you stand that? And it's actually not that bad. I know last year at the symposium that we had in Colorado, both of the neurologists that we have there, we're talking about LPs, and you can just see all the people starting to roll their eyes. Well, the neurologists aren't going to say it's bad, of course. But then I could stand and say, hey, I've done 5 of them, and the one thing I've learned is you don't go out and shovel snow after you get one, because then you end up with a pretty severe headache. But other than that, I've gone through them without much. And as far as the signal study, I was involved in going in and getting infusions, and I actually never had an IV. And then I was getting them every month. And actually, fortunately, I'm a pretty easy stick. But there'd be times I'd be an IV in this hand, and then they'd be taking blood out at this. But it's usually not too bad once you get used to it. I haven't gone through the brain surgery thing yet. That was on the table for the SHIELD study, or as far as getting a possible implant, but that's in. But I know the Unicure study is something that is excitingly still moving forward and resumed. Any questions on any of these fun procedures?
Are there risks associated with lumbar punctures, like, permanent damage, or is there no risk or low risk, or?
I think one of the great things they told me when I went in to get my first one is, that they try to hit this, or they don't try, but they usually, they go in below kind of where all the nerves are. So there's like a little sac down there of spinal fluids. So there's not really much risk of paralysis or anything like that. I think that's what a lot of people get nervous of, having the needle stuck in their back. But it is down pretty low. Can you talk to it? I know you sat in on a lot of them, but I know that was one of the things. Oh, okay, that's not too bad then.
Right, like Greg is saying, you're below the level of the spinal cord itself, so that takes away a lot of the things. Main things that people might experience would be a headache or some people say they get like lower back pain, things like that. There is a type of headache that's directly associated with the lumbar puncture, where it's like if you change positions, when you're laying down you feel okay, when you stand up you don't feel great. That's called a spinal headache. And there's an additional procedure that you can do where you take a little bit of your own blood, and they're able to use fluoroscopy to basically inject your own blood back into that same spot. And basically you kind of think of it like you're kind of leaking a little, so they patch you up. But I will say that is pretty rare. Like we were one of the largest sites in the world for the Generation trial, which the medication was given through a lumbar puncture. And in the course of the 7 years that we've been doing LPs, we've only had to do 2 of those blood patches in my time. The other kind of main risk to keep in mind is that anytime that you break the skin, there is risk of infection. So with that risk, especially with the spinal cord, there is a risk of meningitis. Again, not something we specifically have experienced at our site, and it's pretty rare with lumbar punctures. And kind of interestingly, you do a lumbar puncture to diagnose meningitis, so it's kind of like a funny little, double-edged sword there. But that is another kind of small risk, but again, important to be aware of. Mm-hmm. I'm from a center in Denver. We both are Colorado-based.
Where's that? I heard of some people that went to Buffalo, New York.
Yeah, no, that's a great, so this gentleman, sorry, we've not been doing a great job of repeating our questions, so I'm going to improve that right now for us. This gentleman was just asking if he heard that there were some people in Buffalo who went to lumbar punctures. I suppose one important thing to mention with research studies is oftentimes there's a lot of different sites across the country. So it's not every center of excellence that's doing these studies, but a lot of times there'll be like a California location, Colorado, all over. So it's very possible, sir, that there was probably a site in Buffalo that was doing the same study that we were doing, just with different patients. Mm-hmm.
He was in that one that they actually had a lot of promise, but they ended up stopping. I can't remember what it was called.
I think that generation study. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That was just like a couple of years ago or something.
Mm-hmm.
Stopped that. Yeah.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. And so we missed what study you guys were doing. We came in a little late.
Oh yeah, no problem. We're just talking about general research, but yeah, exactly. But sounds like very well versed.
Yeah. And the best thing about LP is to get you out of shoveling snow for 48 hours.
I've got 23 lumbar injections for the root transplant, and I love going to the acupuncturist, so I am super friendly with needles, but I had no side effects except for once a little pain in the back because, a nerve was hit. But that, and one time I had where there was like liquid in my head, like when I bent over, I could feel my brain was like weird, but that was it. And I feel like it's so, but I'm very needle friendly, so not everyone knows that. And a lot of women have it for pregnancies, so half the population has gone through it, right?
Right. Yep.
Did your symptoms go away then?
Yeah, everything was,
Right, okay.
they check you so thoroughly, on the phone, they keep you there, you have to move to make sure that, the brain, that the medicine is moving in your brain for half an hour, you pace the hallway and and then you're checked out with the neurologist. So it was super efficient and very well done, very well done. I highly recommend it. And there's also the placebo effect, which I know they don't talk about.
Oh, right.
Oh, we got a slide.
Oh, we got a slide
that.
on it.
We got a slide for you.
Yeah, she's a
Okay, I'll talk to you.
Just for the streamers at home, this lovely lady was just telling us about her experience getting lumbar puncture. She's had over 23 as part of the trial, tolerated most of them pretty dang well. So it's great to hear. Yeah.
Is it possible to do the lumbar punctures if the patient has disc herniation? If there's a hernia on the disc,
That would probably just depend on the location of the herniation, because most of the time the lumbar punctures are done kind of in the, Yeah, exactly. And that low spine. So it just depends on the, the exact location. And that would probably be something to be really important to talk about with your doctor and maybe, make sure that they're aware of that. They might request to do some imaging. Again, want to make sure that they're safe. Depending on where it is, they might be able to work around it. But again, safety top priority. So that would be something that they would want to evaluate in a little more depth. Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. How long do trials take and what is the commitment? There are trials that I've been signed up for and they're short term. They last just up to a year, some of those phase 1 trials or initial phase 2 trials. The long-term trials could be multiple years. As I mentioned, the Signal trial I was involved with, it was initially an 18-month trial. It ended up being a 3-year trial. And the frequency can vary to once a year in some of the observational trials like the enroll studies, and then you can come in for multiple days in the same week for some of the trials that are out there. Or, I was going in once a month and then traveling to Nashville about every 6 months. I can tell you where to get the best pork chop sandwich on Broadway. And the visit durations, they can last from about an hour. You can go in and get out real quick, or you can go in and spend all day and do some of the certain treatments and the testing in the morning I would do, and then I'd go grab some lunch and then come back and then get my IV and my drug treatment in the afternoon. So sometimes you're there all day and sometimes you're there just for an hour. Just really key to try to schedule it around rush hour. So, and then also a very important piece of it, and I always ask for it when I talk with my research coordinator, is can I see that informed consent form? When I ask for that before I actually go into that visit so I can take a look at it. And the most key piece for me is kind of what this represents, which is what's going to happen every time I go in. So every month, I'm going to get this assessment or that assessment, or I'm going to see the neurologist, or, I'm going to get the drug trial at that time, or this is when I'm going to go in for an MRI, those kinds of things. And just trying to be as informed as possible as the participant really helps out the research coordinator, as well as, kind of keeping you, so you're not asking all these questions. You can see it on these spreadsheets. I like spreadsheets.
Right, and the goal of this document is to be, as transparent as possible with what the study entails, because it can be a large commitment, it can be small, but again, just making sure that you have as much information before you sign up as possible. And one point I do just want to make about that previous slide with those different components that we had. Not all studies have all of those, and it varies again study to study. So like Greg's saying, this, a lot of consent forms will include something like this. That way exactly kind of what you're signing up to before you sign up.
And you need to know it can change, but usually they stay pretty close to this because they get these protocols approved. But for example, the big long study I was involved in, when they expanded it, then they gave me an additional sheet of what the next year and a half is going to look like. So, and that, that's usually a good thing, just because they're getting more data points all the time.
Any questions on that part?
Here you go.
Yes, our placebo.
So,
Oh yeah, no problem. So placebo, I'm sure we're all probably familiar with it, but just to make sure, generally identical to the intervention that's being tested, but is not active and is not expected to have a real effect on patient health. So if it's like an oral medication, it would be a sugar pill. If it's an infusion, maybe you're getting saline, right? It's basically something that looks exactly the same but is not active. I like to kind of think of placebo as, a kind of a necessary evil in clinical research. I know, of course, if we had it our way, we'd all get the good stuff, so to speak. But the reality is that we really need to make sure that the study medication that we're testing is safe and effective. And like you said so kindly, the placebo effect, right? That's a very real thing. So sometimes just the hope that you're getting something to make you better will actually show that you're getting better, right? And it's not actually related to anything that's actually changing, but it's just that hope, again, that's kind of driving that. So you think, if I give everyone in the study the active drug and we all get this much better, I'm not going to be able to tell if the study drug is actually working or not. But if I give half the people placebo and half the people the intervention, people on placebo are here, but the people on the intervention are here, then you've got a much more clear picture that the study medication is potentially doing what we want it to. So again, necessary evil in some ways.
Yeah, and it's important to realize or take a look at the study and how they're set up, because it's not 50-50. Sometimes the study's placebo and then this much drug and then this much drug. So take a look at that, because it might be a 1 in 3 that there might be the placebo out there. So that's something to take in consideration when you're looking at some of these drug trials. And there might be a 2 out of 3 chance you're going to be getting the drug. But I do want to encourage people, even with the consideration of placebo, any data point is a good data point, regardless if you're on the placebo or not. And sometimes I've been on the placebo and sometimes I have not.
Any questions?
Questions? This is an important question. I know when I started getting involved with studies way back when, and involved with HSG in particular, is making sure that there was data that I could read and understand after the studies had been completed. HD Buzz has done a great job with that over time, being able to tell you how this study's, what didn't work in it or what pieces of it did work. So you do, usually get a letter after you've been involved, thanking you for your participation and letting you know whether you were on the placebo or what level of the drug you were on. And then just give you some information about the study. I know with the Signal study that I was involved with, they actually did calls every 6 to 8 months with the participants. You could just call in and ask questions of the sponsor for that. And that was really good, just to hear what other people that were concerned that were in the study were. And hopefully, as they move forward with some of these other studies, they'll have that opportunity too. I think that was good. It was a disappointing outcome in the study for the participants, but it was good to be able to have the conversation with the sponsor of the drug trial. Any other questions about this? Yes.
Just real quick, you said you have both the placebo and the actual pharmacological. Have you been in a study at all where you found out you had the placebo, and then because of the positive results, people were able to continue on the med, and then were you able to take the actual medication?
A lot of the things and the questions that I ask a lot is, that's called open label study, which typically they'll have after, if they get a positive result on a drug, then the participants that are in that study that are on the placebo will be able to be on the drug itself. So there is that. Unfortunately, there hasn't been anything that's kind of got to that point where there's been enough strong positive result that they have open labeled it. I think for some of the other drugs, for the symptom management, they have done that.
Yeah,
We could
there's
talk
definitely
about
been a couple studies where even before you find out whether you're receiving placebo or not, they might have it built in where you can kind of like do a blind roll into that open label, like Greg is saying, where you know, you don't know what you were on before, but then you can go into kind of a second phase of the study where everyone is definitely receiving the active study drug, and then still eventually you'll find out what you got maybe kind of in that first phase, but that is sometimes how it's set up. Or like Greg is mentioning, sometimes there'll be a pause where they'll look at the study data and confirm whether they're going to proceed with that next phase or not. So kind of can vary again. I feel like that's all I'm saying is like every study is different, but hopefully it's still helpful. Who knows?
And as we talked a little bit and have heard in some of the conversations, you know, there's positive trials and there's negative trials. And did you want to
Yeah, sure.
take the lead on that?
Yeah. For every study, you have to pick something called like the primary endpoint of the trial. So it's, you know, before you start the study, in order to have good, you know, data integrity with our science, right, you have to pick kind of, okay, what do we think we're going to show the most change in? So, you know, for a symptom study, if we're testing a study to try to help maybe with chorea, the movements in HD, then we're going to say, okay, we're going to use that movement scale as our primary endpoint to see if that's where we can have the most change between the placebo and the active study drug. So if you hear of a study being positive, that generally means it met that primary endpoint. So it means that it statistically, right, statistics are always important in science, so it statistically was different from the placebo. It was, you know, hopefully safe and well tolerated. Again, all medications generally have some risks of side effects, so maybe not perfect, but we have a better understanding of what those are. And then, you know, if we're early in the pipeline, meaning that maybe we'll move on to the next phase of the study, or, you know, again, fingers crossed, we're all hoping to be at the end of the pipeline, and that means that potentially that new study medication can go to the FDA for approval. Of course, like we kind of talked about, on the other side is potential for a negative trial, meaning that it didn't meet that primary endpoint, whether it stopped early, you know, potentially like we kind of talked about with that generation trial that was stopped early for safety reasons, or maybe you get all the way through the trial and then looking back at the data, it didn't meet that endpoint. That's also a possibility. But things that I think are really important to kind of keep in mind is that there might be something to consider, and just because the trial was negative doesn't mean necessarily that the whole, you know, we got to scrap the whole project, because there can be some important things to consider, like did we pick the right thing to target? Did we have the right patients involved in the trial? Were we given the right dose at the right frequency? You know, there can be some different things to look back at. And so the big hitter thing here you can see at the bottom is just because we didn't learn what we want to, doesn't mean we didn't learn anything, right? Like Greg says.
Because we got data points.
There we go. Exactly. So just because we maybe don't learn what we want to, it's still important to, you know, continue to move forward. And sometimes process of elimination, right? Maybe we learn that something didn't work, but that means that all these really smart people at this convention can shift their efforts and try to look at something else, right? So again, learning something every step of the way is important.
I just want to make a comment, just so much of why I believe in the, placebo effect is people were so kind to me in my clinic of excellence. And it was like, there were so many devoted people at the hospital or and that has a huge effect in your sense of well-being. And so that's why, like, I did 2 drug trials. Both times I got the max of the drug, and one didn't work at all, and then the last one, the Roche one, I really thought helped me. So I do feel like, but I also feel like the placebo effect, the love and kindness of people matter.
No, I'll have to say I haven't been involved in a study where I haven't had really great research coordinators, either at our Center of Excellence at the Rocky Mountain Movement Disorders, or we have a Center of Excellence at the University of Colorado also, and I had a really good research coordinator there. But I think it really, you know, going in as a research participant and being informed and being prepared really helps with that line of communication with the coordinators as well as the neurologists, because you see neurologists usually most of the time that you go in there for that. So I think just keeping yourself involved and informed and educated about what is all the research that is going on out there and being able to talk to that really helps you out, and getting your care partner engaged in that also too. Okay. And this is like the first question I asked when I got involved in a study. Does the trial use your name? And that was even way back in the Fayer study. And like, no, they do not use your name, you're a number. And sometimes they double blinded, so you're two numbers. But your identity and personal information, the responses aren't disclosed to anyone outside the research team, unless you've agreed upon that and sharing some of those things. Because I know sometimes I've gone in for some studies and they've asked about, personal family history and those kinds of things, and you share some of that stuff for some of these studies, so that they can have, a better idea of, your background, because I've actually gone to some poster sessions at HSG, and they'll have a poster there, and they actually pulled information from the Predict HD study or the Pharaoh study, and being able to, one of the interesting posters I just always remember seeing is the age of onset for folks and what information they had, and they had pulled it from the Predict HD study at that time, and being able to see that when people were raised in an HD family where they saw somebody with HD, they typically had a little bit earlier onset than people that were raised outside of an HD family, like myself. My dad was killed in a car accident, so I wasn't able to see him progress, or wasn't responsible for taking care of him. So I think there's some differences, and I asked the guy at the time why that was, and he said, well, just some of the psychological as well as the emotional taxing of being in an HD family, as most of you guys understand, can pull on you. So, but it's interesting what they can pull out of these studies and the questions that they ask you. And I remember doing vocabulary words one time. Why are you asking me vocabulary words? And they wanted to try to figure out what education level you're at and those kinds of things. So there's all kinds of interesting things that I've had to answer. And what do you eat? How many times do you eat green beans a week? Way back when. So I'm sure they correlate that, and they probably have a really awesome spreadsheet for it. So one of the neat things I did find out, and this was coming to a convention years ago, is the data is shared across these different studies. So, the data points that came in from Pharaoh's got shared with Predict HD and are now part, I'm sure, folded into Enroll. So, all this information gets shared from one study to another, which just makes those data points even more valuable.
Any questions on that part?
No.
Here's the important question, and how to get involved. Get involved with Enroll HD. You all heard that last night if you came to the study. That really kind of is your gateway observational trial to find out. The research coordinators then know who you are. You meet folks. You make those connections, so if those drug trials come up, or interventional trials come up, that you can get involved in it. Another thing that you better be able to say after you're done with 3As here is HD Trial Finder, going to the HDSA website, going to the Trial Finder, putting in your zip code, and it will let you know all the studies that are going on and give you some level of what the criteria are. But importantly, it shows you kind of who those contacts are. It'll give you Liza's name if you're here in Colorado or they're in Colorado. So, but this is really, really important just to get engaged and stay engaged, and even when things don't turn out to be, the solution, knowing you got those data points and that we're going to move forward, and there's going to be something else coming around the corner, because there's always things, and we'll hear a lot about that this weekend.
Yeah, and one thing too is a lot of the interventional trials will have travel support. I know not everyone is fortunate enough to live super close to a center of excellence, or maybe, the study isn't being offered directly in your state, but a lot of these interventional trials offer that travel support for you and your companion to be able to, fly into the center, get your ground transportation, a hotel covered, things like that. So just to reassure you, even if it's not immediately accessible by car or anything like that, just, still being proactive, like Greg is saying, on that trial finder, seeing, maybe even if it's not in your area, if it's still something you're interested in, be your biggest advocate, call those other centers and just ask about it, because they might be willing to accept patients from afar. So, just know that. I know for, we had, again, kind of that generation study, we had a patient flying from New Jersey and one from Arkansas, and, coming from all over. So just, again, being aware that just because maybe it's not at your immediate center, or if you're not able to access it easily, like it's still an option for you, hopefully.
Okay. And key takeaway points. Research is not a one-size-fits-all. Maybe you're comfortable with doing observational trials and maybe not the interventional trials or intervention trials. As Liza said, every trial is a little bit different, and every study is a little bit different. So you want to kind of look around and see. Sometimes things come up. A couple different things might come up at a time. Or in my case, there was 3 things out there that I could possibly, and they all 3 kind of moved off the screen. And it's sometimes easy not to, it's easy to get a little ticked off about that or a little depressed about that, but knowing that there is going to be something else out there, because there's really a lot of great science going on and around HD, so just hanging in there for the next thing. And it's important, as I've been saying, is to understand that full picture before you go in and participate. So you're not surprised, when they're saying, oh, you're going to have to curl up on this bed and get this, lumbar puncture. So that's going to be that next visit. So just understanding that, some basics of how that drug is working or is going to work, and what it's trying to target is always great when you're going in to talk to the researchers.
Perfect.
Got anything else? Anybody
Any
other
other
questions?
questions?
So now I do have a slide. My next slide is to answer the question that you most have is, what is burro racing? This is from last Saturday in my hometown of Georgetown, Colorado, and that's my grandson. And if you want to have a picture of your grandson, just volunteer to do a talk, and you can show off your awesome grandkids. That's Blaster following us, and my grandson was waiting for me at the finish line and was taking the lead rope in. You do not ride the burro, you lead the burro, or more correctly, the burro leads you and what you're going to do. But it's a new sport that I've just taken up, just to keep moving that brain around. So thanks.
Does anybody get, in the trials and stuff, are there people that would get worse from any of the experiments?
Yeah, that question is, can people get worse from the experiments? Potentially. Obviously our goal is to try to help people, and we don't want to cause any further problems. But unfortunately, these are investigational medications, and so that's why we're doing these studies, right? Is we're trying to learn as much as we can, trying our best to keep people safe and not worsen any symptoms. And if at any point that becomes clear, then sometimes that can be a pause, further evaluations. One thing that would be probably good to touch on is that a lot of research studies have something called like a data safety monitoring committee or a data safety monitoring board, and they will, kind of look at the data periodically to try to make sure, again, that people are, being kept as safe as possible, that there's not unnecessary risks that need to be evaluated. And, if there are things that are found, is there something we can do to change the study to make people safer, any adjustments that can be made? Or if it's, do we need to just stop? So that's a very fair question. But,
Did you ever experience anything in side effects that lasted short or a long time, or?
Not really, other than the snow shoveling incident. I was out, after I got an LP, but other than that, actually, when I started on the signal study, I did notice a taste in my mouth after I got the IV. It was kind of a metallic-y kind of taste. So that gave me some indication I probably wasn't getting saline. But after about 3 treatments, that kind of went away and my body kind of adjusted to that. But I talked to both the neurologists, both Dr. Kumar and Dr. Seeberger that was heading that up, and I go, I kind of tasted things a little funny, and then you kind of get a funny little look out of their eyes when you mention that. But they didn't, of course, they can't share much with you, but just my knowledge of getting IVs, when you get a funny taste in your mouth, that usually means you're getting something.
So how many did it? 5?
Pardon?
5?
You've done 5 studies, he's asking?
5 lumbar?
Oh, I've done, 5 lumbar punctures. I got a long way to get the Giovanna record. Any other questions? Well, thank you much, and we all welcome you to Colorado sometime. So come on out.